What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we diving into some more Strixhaven decks that I've come across in my time playing Magic the Gathering here on the arena. Some of these decks may be decks that you're familiar with. Some of these decks may be decks that you may not have seen before. These are decks that I've kind of come across playing against, and I felt like it was kind of interesting to kind of go ahead and build my own version of these decks. So if you have seen these decks, let me know in the comments below which ones you like, maybe which ones you want to check out. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. Also, if you hit that like button, it lets me know you guys like these style of videos. With that being said, let's dive into the decks and let's talk about them. All right, so this first deck up is something that you may have seen on a couple creators' channels. I feel like I've seen a few creators actually make their own versions of this deck. And this is an Izzet Dragon Treasure style deck. Essentially, what we're trying to do here is trying to play the control game early, get our dragons out in the later game. Essentially, our dragons are going to be a way of creating treasure tokens. Goldspan Dragon, making our treasure tokens sacrifice, produce 1 mana of any color. If we have Goldspan Dragon out, these actually sacrifice produce 2 mana of any one color, which is also fairly good. Then we also have Izzet Dragons, the new dragon from Strixhaven. It's a flyer, enters the battlefield, create a treasure token. Artifacts we control have tap, add 1 mana of any color, spend this mana to only cast instants or sorcery spells. So essentially, creates treasure tokens as well, which instead of sacrificing, we can always tap them now to produce mana. Outside of that, the deck is trying just to kind of get us to this point in the game where we kind of take over by playing our dragons, as well as having a bunch of interruptions, ways to dig a little bit deeper in our deck, as well as we are playing snow with the deck to kind of, take advantage of a few of the snow cards. Things like Selesnya and Frostbite are two of the key cards there that really, utilize us having a lot of snow on the battlefield. Other than that, we have some spell disruption with Solid Summon, Tested Talents, as well as Mystical Dispute. Very interesting there when it comes to what we're trying to do there. We have a balance of each. Solid Summon and Mystical Dispute are kind of our universal counter spells where they counter target spell regardless. Mystical Dispute gets cheaper if it counters a blue spell, where it costs only 1 blue mana if it counters a blue spell, but our opponent has to pay 3 in order to not counter it. Solid Summon, we can foretell it in the early game, set it up for a late game counter. Other good thing is if we set this up in the early game, we play something like Goldspan Dragon, create a treasure token. Our opponent tries to target our Goldspan Dragon with a spell. Therefore, we create a treasure token. We can use that 2 mana now from that treasure token to actually counter that spell that's targeting our Goldspan Dragon, which is definitely a very good, unique kind of style of gameplay. Other than that, I'll just kind of go through the list here to kind of give you a little bit of a rundown. You may even see a video of me playing the deck a little bit just to kind of give you some idea of what the gameplay is as you play it. But we have 4 copies of Frostbite here. Initially, it's a shock that deals 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If we have 3 or some more snow permanents, it deals 3 damage instead. Definitely very good. Like I said, we are playing snow lands in the deck. We have 2 copies of Tested Talents. Definitely a very interesting counter spell. It only counters targets instances of sorceries, but what we can do is we can search our controller's graveyard, hand, library, and for any number of cards with the same name as that spell, exile them, that player shuffles, and then draw cards equal to the number of cards exiled from their hand this way. So if we do exile spells that share the name of the spell that they just cast, they do get to draw a card in return. But most of the time, like especially against something like an ultimatum deck, this is definitely a good interruption because typically your opponent's only usually going to have one unless the shuffler is working perfectly fine, and they may have multiple copies. But most of the time they have the 1 copy, counter it, and then we get rid of all the other copies, and then they have to physically play all their spells out of their deck manually. Fire Prophecy for that spot removal, allowing us to also deal 3 damage, while also taking a card from our hand, put it into the bottom of our library, and then draw a new card. So if we just gotten land flooded, we'd want to draw maybe a spell or something. Maybe we can, put a card on the bottom, draw a new card. We have Expressive Iteration. This card's actually fairly interesting. It's not a card you really want to play in the early game just because you're still playing your lands, and if you do top deck a land, and then 2 spells, you may want to maybe put one of those spells into your hand, maybe put the land into the exile, and maybe put one of those things on the bottom of your library. If you get unlucky and draw only 1 spell and 2 lands, and you've already played your land for the turn, then one of your lands are going to get exiled, the spell's going to go to your hand, and then the other one's going to go to the bottom of your library. So it's one of those things I would say is maybe wait until turn 3 or turn 4 with, just because you have open mana, and you can also dig a little bit deeper, maybe just to dig up a land to put on the battlefield instead of playing one from your hand. At the same time, too, taking advantage of spells that you can dig up in the process in the later game. Mystical Dispute, like I said, it's a counter spell, pretty straightforward. Brazen Borrower for the bounce, and also a 3/1 flyer with flash. Definitely good there, just for some disruption, kind of stall out what your opponent's doing. If they play something or have a counter like token on the battlefield, you can always bounce a token back through the hand, and then it just dissolves because it's a token. saw it come in as another counter spell that we can foretell. Bone Crusher Giant, because why not? It's Bone Crusher Giant. It's a very solid red card. It has 3 mana for 3 and a 2 mana 2 damage to any target. Prismatic Command's another interesting one. Just in the basis that we can choose to, we can deal 2 damage to target creature or target to any target, so even the opponent's face. We can also target player draws 2 cards and discards 2 cards. So if we feel like we're really land flooded and we just need to discard some lands that were just drawn, we can discard 2 lands but also draw 2 in the process. We can also create a treasure token, which allows us to ramp up a little bit. And if our opponent plays something like an Embercleave, we can always destroy target artifact, or maybe whatever artifact they decide to play out in the battlefield. In the mid range, we have both dragons, both creating treasure tokens. One allowing us to use these treasure tokens to cast spells that are instants and sorceries without having to sacrifice. The other one making treasure tokens that we can sacrifice for 2 mana of any one particular color instead of the original 1. Both very good. Both can be kind of catch our opponent off guard. And then the top end, we have 4 copies of Alrund's Epiphany, because why not? We're going to be producing a decent amount of mana. Taking extra turns is definitely very going to get some bird tokens out of it is always a plus. And then we have Magma Opus, which is another interesting card here. It's a very good big top end card where we can deal 4 damage divided among us we choose to any number of targets. So if they have creatures or planeswalkers or even their face, we can deal that 4 damage to any number of targets and divide it however we want to. We can also tap 2 target permanents, and then we create a 4/4 blue-red elemental token creature, and then we draw 2 cards. In the early game, if we feel like we aren't going to get there and we need to be aggressive and draw, we can always discard it, put it in our graveyard, and create a treasure token. And then other than that, we just have a array of lands. We have a balance of snow mountains and islands at 5 apiece, 4 of the pathways, 4 of the volatile forward, 4 Fabled Passages to kind of filter our mana to get to the colors we need, because we do need to hit double blue and double red, so getting us to each of those is definitely very good. And then we have 3 copies of Faceless Haven, so we can swing in to our opponent's face if our opponent has done a pretty decent job of keeping our board pretty clean of creatures. Other than that, I mean, this deck is, like I said, very interesting on what it's trying to do. We're just trying to control the early game, get into the mid game, and then hit them in the face in the late game by taking extra turns and also playing Magma Opus. Other than that, it's a very fun deck. And let's move on to the next one. So this next deck here is a deck that I may have already done once on the channel. I've made some couple tweaks with it, just from what I've been seeing people are playing with it, and it's pretty much mono black auras or mono black with like Lurras and auras and things like that. But what we're doing here is we're playing a couple of new cards, or newer cards that I didn't have in the previous version. One of them being Blood Sky Berserker. It's a 2 mana 1/1, but whenever we cast our second spell each turn, we have to put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. It gains menace to end a turn. So this thing can definitely become out of hand very, very quickly on turn 3, turn 4. This thing can become a 3/3, 5/5, depending on how many spells you've played. Our deck is on the cheap side, most of our cards being 2 mana or less. We have a couple cards in the 3 mana slot just because, but they're spells, so they don't actually count against Lurras, so we're allowed to play them. But we have 4 copies of Archane's Vessel, 1/1 for 1 with lifelink, and if we ever cast it from the graveyard back onto the battlefield, we can exile it and make a 5/5 demon instead. Deadweight is another interesting card here. It's our way to kind of just remove spot removal instead of playing things like Heartless Act or anything like that. We can give target creature -2/2, which then plays into the Hateful Eidolon. Whenever enchanted creature we control. Whenever enchanted creature dies, draw a card for each aura we controlled attached to it. So if we put a dead weight on our opponent's creature, we're going to then draw a card for it. It's definitely a good way for this deck to dig a little bit deeper. We have Malakir of Rebirth, which is another interesting one here. I cut down on the lands because we are on the cheaper end, so I added in this as like a different land. It's a modal land, so it goes come into the battlefield tap and produces black mana. But the benefit here is we can choose target creature. We lose 2 life until end of turn. That creature gains when this creature dies, return to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. So it gives us a little bit of protection in that manner. Definitely pretty good. It's a good way to kind of save our Lurras from possibly dying, and it's also at instant speed, so our opponent may not expect it, and it's only 1 mana, which is also very good. We have Moga's Favor, which is another interesting card here. It gives +2/-1. We can escape it for 3 mana by exiling 2 other cards from our graveyard, and we enchant a creature, and this just allows us to make our creatures, because most of them are like 1 power, maybe 2 toughness. They're not very aggressive, so if we aren't drawn really into our Blood Sky Berserker very aggressively, we can always play a Moga's Favor and just be a little bit more aggressive that way by making like a Scorpion a 3/1, which definitely makes it a little bit more aggressive than a 1/2. We already went over Blood Sky Berserker, just getting +2/+2. counters every time we play a second spell, and also gain a menace, which is definitely very good. Evasion's always a plus, I think, when it comes to playing these cheaper decks that are a little bit lower to the ground and just trying to get in for that extra damage. Elderfang Disciple is another interesting one here. Just some hand disruption, just making our opponent discard a card is always very good. There's a lot of decks out there that kind of dump their hand, and if they may hold things until later game, but they may only have 1 or 2 cards left, and you can discard a card that may be holding onto for that later game is always very good. Myers Grasp is just another enchantment aura that gives target creature -3/-3, another target of Lurras, allowing us to get that card back. If we, the creature does die from it, we can always replay it on another creature and just continue that process as long as Lurras is out on the battlefield. Call the Death Dweller is a little bit of protection just in case any of our creatures die. We may not have Lurras out on the battlefield, or we need to get our Lurras back to the battlefield. They come back onto the battlefield with a Death Touch counter on either of them and or a Menace counter on either of them. So if we bring back a Lurras, we put both counters on it. If we bring back one of our other creatures or 2 of our other creatures, we get a counter on one, maybe a counter on the other, maybe put both of them on one and on the other. Definitely interesting there. And then another interesting card that I decided to add in is it's just definitely another card that has a little bit more versatility to it. It's another card that allows us to get things back from the graveyard, makes our opponent discard 2 cards, and then we can also destroy target creature with mana value 3 or less. So it has a multiple use, and also we can dump it if we really want to by paying 4 additional mana on top of the initial 3 mana. And if it was kicked, we can choose any number, so we can do all of them. If we are in the late game, we just really want to just do a whole bunch of things. Make our opponent discard 2 cards, return target creature card with mana value 2 or less to the battlefield, and then destroy target creature with mana value 3 or less. So definitely overall pretty good. And like I said, running a little bit lower on lands. I think the deck only has 21 land main board lands, so it's 18 there, 3 castles, and like I said, the Malakir Rebirth makes up the other 3. So we do play 24 lands, but Malakir is actually 3 of them. You could always add in the black land that came from Zendikar Horizon that you can play as a modal land, where you can also draw cards and bring them out onto the battlefield if you want to do that. We're not draw cards. You can tap X and 3 black mana, and you can return creatures of conversion cost equal to the X and less back onto the battlefield. So if you tap like 6, you get to return a 3, 2, and a 1 or something like that. I think that's how that works, if I'm not mistaken. I can't think off the top of my head. If you know, let me know in the comments below. But overall, this deck is on the cheaper side, maybe compared to the last one. Not really playing too many rares outside of the Inscription Ruin, the Castle Lochthwain, and the Lurras, I think, is the most part are the rares. But overall, pretty fun deck. Definitely good against these more aggressive, like small creatures style decks that are trying to just get very wide very quickly. A lot of this disruption with like Deadweights and Myers Grasp really disrupts what your opponent's trying to do. And like I said, it's definitely like you are countering them with like also taking down their smaller creatures. Now on to the next deck. Now, this next deck is probably the most expensive when it comes to the rarities and the amount of wild cards you're going to need to probably craft this deck, just because it is a little bit on the expensive side when it comes to especially the lands. There are a lot of rare lands in the deck, as well as there's a few mythics and rares within the main board. But what this deck is like a Mardu sacrifice deck. So if you haven't seen this deck played, the idea here is, you may even see it on the screen, is we are actually, our one key card is we are playing Awaken, the Blood Avatar, our Extus. But the whole goal here is to play the Awaken side of the Extus, just because the idea here, this card does cost 2 less for each creature we sacrifice to cast a spell. And each opponent sacrifices a creature. Then we create a 3/6 black-red avatar creature with haste, and whenever this creature attacks, it deals 3 damage to each opponent. So essentially, it creates its own Kroxa within it, except for our opponent doesn't discard. They sacrifice a creature in the process. But the idea, what we're trying to do is we're trying to play a couple cards that allow us to take our opponent's creatures, and then we can also use them to sacrifice to the Awakened Blood Avatar in the process. So the idea, a lot of our early game is a lot of small things goes into our sideboard, but it's a lot of small things. We have Garrison Cat, which is an interesting card here. When it dies, we create a 1/1 human soldier creature token. So essentially, if we sacrifice it to the Extus, we can just get a 1/1 back on the battlefield, just as a little bit extra protection, maybe just in case we get a little bit aggressive, we want to leave a chump blocker back. We have Giant Killer here for the spot removal with the 3 chop down ability, or we can just play it as a 1/2 if we just need some cheap sacrificer fodder. Eye Twitch allowing us to go to our learn board, allowing us to kind of maybe get a spell, maybe like a pest summon in or something like that. And a 1/1 flyer, definitely not bad. Village Rites, just allowing us to sacrifice our creatures, our opponent's creatures that we may take with some of our spells that take our opponent's creatures, and then drawing 2 cards in the process. Tame the Firstborn, yet again another one of these cards, allowing us to gain control of target creature with mana value 3 or less until end of turn. We untap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn. Another interesting card, another interesting thing you can do here is we could technically play it on any of our creatures in our deck that cost 3 or less, give that creature haste in general, and we can attack it aggressively if that's something we want to do. And then we also have Professor Symbology, another card that allows us to go into our learn board over on the side. It's a 2/1 for 2 mana, so not too bad. Bastion of Remembrance, if we're sacrificing creatures, might as well be pinging our opponent for damage in the process. Also creates a 1/1 white human soldier creature token, and then whenever a creature we control dies, each opponent loses 1 life, we gain 1 life. Woe Strategist, another card that has an ability that we can sacrifice a creature. We get to scry 1. If we take our opponent's creature, we can always sacrifice it to scry if we don't want to give it back in the process, and it doesn't matter, you know, what the cost is. We can always take it and sacrifice it in the process. We play two copies of the Akroan War, another interesting saga that helps us take our opponent's things until we can take their 1 creature until as long as it's on the battlefield. We make our opponent's creatures attack on chapter 2 if they're able, and then each tapped creature deals damage to itself equal to its power. So essentially turn 2 sets up for turn 3. So any creatures that have attacked on turn 2 or chapter 2 will then die on chapter 3. And like I said, Awaken the Blood Avatar is the main idea. We're trying to play this spell for initially just 1 black and 1 red. We can play it for more, but the goal is to play it for the cheapest as possible. I guess worst case scenario, you can always play Exodus as well, and then whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, return target non-legendary creature card from your graveyard to your hand. And our deck has a lot of those non-legendary. I don't think anything in our deck other than himself is legendary, so we can definitely get anything back from our graveyard to our hand, allowing us to recast it and just take advantage of it that way. And then like I said, the mana base is probably the most interesting here. It's kind of one of those things. Sometimes it draws pretty good, sometimes it draws not. It does play a decent amount of pathways, so depending on what you're looking for, you kind of have to make the decision of what mana color I need depending on the pathway you are drawing. But 4 copies of a plains, 1 copy of castle, 3 copies of swamps, 2 castles of mountains, 4 of the bright climb pathway / grim climb pathway, 4 copies of seer step and blight step pathway, 4 copies of pillar verge or needle verge pathway, and then we have 3 copies of the Triome, which is just definitely a great land. It just produces, you know, one of the colors we need for this Mardu style deck. Of course, we have a learn / lesson board. We have 1 copy of Academic Probation, just to kind of stop our opponent maybe from playing that particular spell that we think they may cast, like if they have some sort of board wipe, or maybe they are playing something like Winota, and we know they're going to probably play Winota on the next turn. We can maybe slow them down from playing that. Or we can make target creature not be able to block our attack, which is also pretty good, and its activated abilities can't be activated. Environmental Sciences, because why not? Might as well filter our mana to get the right colors if we need to search for that mountain or maybe search for that plains, whatever it is. We can always play Environmental Sciences because it is 2 colorless. Reduce to Memory as that spot removal because it's exile non-land permanent, so it's anything that's not a land that we can exile it. They get a 3/2 out of it, but you know, we do get to maybe stop them from having some big powerful creature or spell on the battlefield, which is definitely good. Pest Summoning just to create some sacrifice fodder, as well as they are decent chump blockers where we gain life in the process. Some Necrotic Fumes where we can exile target creature or planeswalker by sacrificing a creature we control. And of course, Mascot Exposition, just because, you know, it's a deck that, you know, we're trying to sacrifice things, create some aggressiveness on the battlefield by creating 1 token of each, 2/1 white fly and black Inkling, 3/2 red white spirit creature token, and a 4/4 blue red elemental creature token. Just a diverse set of creature tokens that we can put on the battlefield. 1 attack in with, 2 we can also use it for our Awaken the Blood Avatar. Now moving on to the next and last deck. This one's a very interesting deck, and the last deck is a green-white counters deck that we're running Lurras as our companion. I think I saw a video go up on CGB's channel actually of a very similar deck, and he does have a couple cards that are very similar. But I mean, overall, you know, I guess it's one of those things. I kind of went for like a little bit on the budget side. Sure, I do have maybe a few more rares than maybe a budget deck that I normally would make has, because I had the pathways on for 1, as well as I have Aspirants in here because we're trying to do a +1/+1 style deck. So we have Aspirants, and we also have Ozolith and Shadow Spear, which is also very good. Also Swarm Shambler. So to be honest, there's a lot more rares than I thought. The other one I don't have is the X cost in Artifact that Stone Coil Serpent is something you definitely could add in the deck. But overall, the idea of the deck is just putting +1/+1 counters on our creatures. We're taking advantage of things like Conclave Mentor, because whenever we put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, we get to put an additional +1/+1 counter on that creature instead. And then whenever he dies, we gain life equal to its power. And then we also have other cards that take advantage of this. We have things like Wildwood Scourge. When it enters the battlefield, put it with X +1/+1 counters on it, so we tap X creature. And then whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put on another non-Hydra creature we control, put a +1/+1 counter on Wildwood Scourge. And the idea here is what we're trying to do is pump up our creatures by putting +1/+1 counters on them. Playing something like an Invigorating Surge, which essentially puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control, then double the number of +1/+1 counters on that creature, which definitely makes our creatures even more aggressive. We have Ozolith to possibly, if our creature does die and has +1/+1 counters on it, the +1/+1 counters go on this instead. And then during our next combat step, we get to choose if we want to put those +1/+1 counters on a different creature, which is definitely very good as well. And you may be thinking to yourself, okay, you make big creatures, none of your creatures really have trample. We are playing Rune of Might. Also, if you do play the snake, the artifact snake, you can that creature naturally has trample itself. It also has protection from multicolor, which will also be very good, especially with the way the format is, and it also has reach. So maybe it's one of those things you probably should add to the deck if you're looking to maybe add in a couple more rares. Maybe cut down on the Wildwood Scourge. But overall, like I said, the deck is pretty straightforward. We play things like Guide and Voice. This is a card that allows us to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and we also learn, so we get to go to our learn board. Star Pupil, it's a 1-mana 1/1. It comes on the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. When it dies, we get to move its +1/+1 counter onto target creature control. Interesting thing here is if we have something like a Conclave Mentor out on the battlefield, we do play this for the 1 mana. It actually comes out as a 1-mana 2/2, which is definitely very good. Snakeskin Veil as a protection spell. It gives our creature hexproof until end of turn, which essentially our permanent, the creature that has hexproof has. Can't be targeted by spells our opponent has, so definitely a good way to protect maybe key cards we don't want our opponent to kill with a direct kill spell. And we also get a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Swarm Shambler is a very good card for the deck. Enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. Same thing. If Mentor is out on the battlefield, it actually becomes out on the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters. And then whenever a creature we control with a +1/+1 counter becomes target of a spell an opponent controls, we get a 1/1 insect out of it. So just a way to get a little bit additional creatures on the battlefield. Just in case our creature does die, we get to replace it with a 1/1 at least. And then for 1 mana and tap in the Swarm Shambler, we get a +1/+1 counter on it. Once the Mentor is on the battlefield, that becomes a +2/+2 ability every time we tap it for 1 mana. Vastwood Fortification is an interesting card that I added to the deck. It's an instant speed, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, kind of like a Snakeskin Veil without the ability of the Veil. Also, the benefit here is if we really need the green mana, it can come on the battlefield as a land tapped, which is always very good. 1 copy of Shadow Spear just for the +1/+1 trample and lifelink. Also, the idea here too that's actually very good is you can actually tap 1 mana. And you may be wondering yourself, well, you don't really see many creatures have hexproof or indestructible. Well, if you do play something against like the Winota deck, the creatures that Winota pulls out from the library from her ability actually have indestructible. And if we tap the 1 mana, we can actually now block those creatures and actually kill them in the process if our creatures are bigger, which is definitely very good and allows us to kind of defend it pretty decently against a Winota. Ozolith, like I said before, it's a 1 mana artifact. Then whenever creature control leaves the battlefield, it not even dies, it whenever it leaves. So even if our opponent exiles our creature, we get to put our +1/+1 counters on the Ozolith. And at the beginning of our combat of next turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all the counters from Ozolith onto target creature. So kind of setting up in case our opponent, like I said, directly removes any of our creatures or exiles our board or whatever it is, we can always move these creatures onto the next creature we put on the battlefield. Wildwood Scourge comes on the battlefield, X +1/+1 counters on it. And then whenever we put +1/+1 counters on non-Hydras, we get to put an additional counter on Wildwood Scourge in the process as well, which is always very good. Just getting a big creature very threatening is always a plus. Luminarch Aspirant, if you haven't played mono white, if you probably play mono white, you know what Aspirant does, but essentially she gets to put +1/+1 counters in target creature control. So what you do here is you put this on maybe something like a Swarm Shambler, you have something like Wildwood Scourge out, and then essentially now whenever you put this +1/+1 counter on your Shambler, your Scourge is also getting an additional +1/+1 counter. If we have Conclave Mentor on the battlefield, she'll be putting +2/+2 counters technically on your creature. Rune of Might is our card that we need for the deck to give our creatures trample. So even if your opponent decides to throw a lot of chump blockers in our creatures in the early game, once we get this out, our big creatures with all these +1/+1 counters now have trample, so we can swing in for some big damage. We draw a card out of it, and the creature gets +1/+1. It's not a counter, it's just a +1/+1 additional on top of whatever the creature in power and toughness is. I kind of already went over the Conclave Mentor, but he just puts additional +1/+1 counters on it. 2 mana, 2/2. Invigorate and Surge is like the big finisher. You swing in with maybe like a 10-10, Wild with Scourge or something like that. We put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then we give it double the +1/+1 counters, or maybe even like a small creature, and your opponent's not expecting it. But doubling the counters in general is definitely something that's going to get your opponent caught off guard. If you draw multiple, we have to do this multiple times. We have 7 plains, 5 forests, 4 of the Blossom Sands, and 4 of the Boulder Loft and Branch Loft pathways. Overall, the mana base is pretty straightforward. This is 20 mana plus 2. The deck's not super expensive. Like I said, our top end card's 3 mana, so we don't really need to play a lot of lands, so 22 lands is actually probably pretty good. We do play Lurras as our companion, so we really can't play anything bigger than 3 casting costs when it comes, or 2 casting costs when it comes to permanents. And then going into our learn board, we are kind of limited just because we do play Lurras, so we actually only get to play 6 learn cards in our learn board. So we have 1 Academic Appropriation just to kind of slow down our opponent. Either 1, if they don't have a lot of creatures out, we can get rid of that blocker that could be standing in our way from winning the game. 2, we can stop them from playing their particular spell they may try to cast on their following turn. 2 copies of our Elemental Sciences just because it's a great card to just filter our mana the way we need to. Look for that basic land, maybe of the other color that we need just an additional copy of. Which is always very good, and we gain 2 life in the process. 2 Produce to Memories, just to kind of exile target non-land permanent. That's a 3, and they get a 3/2 in the process if that's what we want to do. Also, then we also have Containment Breach here, destroy target artifact or enchantment if it's mana values 2 or less. Create a 1/1 black creature token in the process. But just a little bit of variety of like some ways to just kind of destroy things. If our opponent's playing like mono white and they have things that give things indestructibility, we probably grab this. If they have things that we can just destroy without any protection, we can always play Containment Breach. This also hits like their Heliod or something that's indestructible. So this is definitely a good way to just remove something that's just in our way. But overall, the deck is pretty fun. It definitely creates big creatures pretty quickly. I do think each of these videos will have some sort of video gameplay over me talking. So instead of just me pointing at the cards and telling you what they do, you'll probably see a little bit of example gameplay, just kind of give you a heads up of what each deck's doing. If you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. All the deck lists will be down in the description below like normal, so you guys can always import them out, maybe tweak them however you like. If you guys are new here and want to see me live, I do stream every Saturday now at 9 a.m. on my channel. Typically, I post the day before I go live with the exact time I'll be going live, so more than likely at the time of recording, I'll be going live this Saturday at 9 a.m. But until next time, guys, I'll see you in the next Magic the Gathering video.